Greetings. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Lisa Osborne Ross, U.S. CEO at Edelman. Thank you so much for finding the time to join us and our partner Blavity for this really important conversation about topics that we have been discussing, but we have put some time and some resources in to really research so that we can inform the smart decisions that we're making, and we can inform our clients and our colleagues and people that we interact with every day. A special, again, shout out and thanks to Blavity. We have said that this has been a journey for us. We started this research last summer, right after George Floyd was murdered, and Blavity was one of the first partners that we engaged. And so, like many of you, Blavity has been on this journey, and I think together we will get to a really good place. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and my partner, Richard Edelman, who is the global CEO of our firm, and the person who has been driving the importance of this research. Richard and I are going to be sharing with you all the first ever look. It has been completed, but this is the first time we're talking about it, but the first ever look at our Trust Barometer Special Report on Business and Racial Justice. The report, again, is an evolution of the work that we started this summer, right after George Floyd was murdered. We went back into the field in August and saw some changes after the Jacob Blake shooting. And this work has informed the counsel that we have been giving to over 400 clients this past summer, who are really trying to find their voice and, more importantly, find their action as it comes to eradicating racial inequities in this country. Following the presentation, Richard's going to do the front end, I'm going to do the second part, and then we're going to hear from a panel of experts so we can have a fulsome conversation about this really important topic, and I hope that you will participate. Richard, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. So if we can put up the first slide, I just want to say that in the intervening months since September 1st, we've had a very hotly contested election. We've had a huge surge in violence against Asians. We've seen a continued effort to change voting right laws. And so the work goes on, and in a certain way is more important than ever. So if we can transition to the next slide. We're just out of the field with a 2,000 person survey. It's a general population. We had more or less 1,150 white, 500 African-American, 500 Latin, and 500 Asian. And pretty even distribution across the regions of the US. Again, equal distribution in terms of 18 to 34, 35 to 54, and 55 plus. We had a slightly over-indexed to Democrats, 44 versus Republican 28, and Independents 23. So I've given you all the caveats, and we came out of the field on April 26th. If we can move to the next one. So you'll recall that during our two studies done in the summer, we had half a dozen key findings. The first is that business is the most trusted institution of the four. Compared to government, media, and NGOs, business is the most trusted institution to act. But business was seen as failing to act. So capacity, failure to act. Employers, my employer was the most trusted. It was the only institution over 60% trust to deal with the racism response. Media was actually seen as fueling racism because of stereotypes, and also basically referring to the people in protests as riots and other things. Brands and corporations were being asked to take a stand. There was definitely a sense of tangible in the relationship between employer and employee. Racism was harming that relationship. Finally, that brands and corporations that took a stand got substantial bumps in trust from doing so, like 3 to 10x. Okay, moving to the next slide. So here's our progress report. In short, we find a pretty poor grade for all institutions. This is 1 year after the murder of George Floyd. It's an important set of final exams. So on the next, the Key statistic is only 1 in 3 Americans believe that we have made progress on racial justice over the past year. 55%, in fact, say things have gotten worse or there's no progress at all. So in short, we have a problem. Moving on, we have a nation divided as to whether the problem is that our people are racist in the country or whether the system has a problem. More or less half-half. African Americans index slightly towards the idea that the system is racist. The next is a key one. The media is failing to report the root causes of racism. This has not changed in the period of a year. We checked this last June. We've just checked this in May. Here we are. And a key result of this, moving to the next slide, is that we don't have trusted information sources about racial justice. In fact, if you look at the way in which people absorb information, for African Americans and for Hispanics, this is consistent with last summer, advocacy and activist organizations are the most important source of information. For none of the groups is mainstream media the most trusted source of information. 1/3 of whites say there is no trusted information source at all. This is a sense somehow of the media is biased, the media is inflammatory, the media is not giving us the facts we need to make decisions. Next. The report card on business is not great. In fact, just about half of the people say that business has failed to do concrete actions to address systemic racism. And a lot of people, more than half, see that, in fact, brands and companies are being performative. They are saying, but not doing. Moving on, the most trusted institution actually is my employer. This is very consistent with our overall findings on trust, that trust has moved local. Trust is in my company. It is placing a huge responsibility on business, its CEOs, and its PR teams to give quality information, to be part of the solve. If you look at these closely, my employer is so important in the context of the frame. 25 points higher than business in general, nearly 30 points higher than government. Also on this slide, very important to note that government has risen. It's still the least trusted institution, but it has risen. It has risen mostly in federal. It has flatlined in state and local. Also, trust in government among Republicans has declined. Trust in all institutions for Republican voters has declined, whether it's my employer, NGOs, business, media, or in government. So the gap between D and R on trust in these institutions is now more or less in the range of 18 to 20 points. Next. So what we're seeing is, in fact, a moment of reckoning for business. Business has all the power to do this. My employer is deeply trusted to do it, but we're not satisfied with how business is performing on this score. Why is this important? If we switch to the next slide. Because brands and companies that stand up and speak up get huge gains in trust. It's deeply important that the private sector be the lead in changing this equation. Specifically, for African Americans, 4.5 times benefit versus risk of loss of trust. Also, 7x for Asians. This is the new big change. The Asian American is the new hot button group among those we surveyed. Also, for Republicans, twice as likely to trust a company or a brand than lose trust. Any idea that this is a partisan issue? False. False, false, false. Next, there's a higher stake for trust here. Here's the story. More or less, since August, we see a higher reaction for those who say if a brand or a company takes action on racial justice. So, for instance, +9 for African Americans, +12 for Asians. Again, as I told you, Asians are the highest group now in terms of reaction about necessity of business needing to stand up. Moving along, we find that in fact, now 42% of consumers told us, I will change my brand. I have shifted my brand choice because of its response or lack of response on systemic racism. That's a 7-point bump from August, particularly among younger, as predictable, particularly among Latinx and African American, but important. There are signs of progress, ladies and gentlemen, by sector. Interestingly, sports ranks #1 industry because of the NBA, because of Major League Baseball. They have heard the call, in part because of pressure from their most important constituent, their own players, but in part because they see this as a place they can lead. Financial services gets the lowest mark, pharmaceuticals just above. Next, this slide of all the slides is perhaps the most important of my section, which is corporations have had a significant rise in trust on dealing with systemic racism. Lisa will explain why, but 13 points up on get your house in order, 13 points up on education and influence change, 12 points up on creating change. Who hasn't had any bump at all? Brands. Brands started out in August with a 5 to 8 point advantage over corporations. Brands were seen, of course, as the social actors. Guess what? People see brands as performative at the moment. It's not good enough for you just to change the faces in the ads. You have to actually do something and not just show it. Do it. Okay, Lisa, to you.
So there's a lot of expectation. There's a lot of opportunity, and it is with employers. So the hard work is ahead. I think there's been a perception or a sense when we started this entire endeavor that I just need to do this thing. I need to say this thing, and then it'll be over. We had this conversation yesterday. You cannot change the tide of systemic racism, 418 years of systemic racism in a summer. So the journey is just beginning and the hard work is ahead. On the next slide, you will see who is getting it right. Richard talked about this, employers. Double-digit gains addressing racism at work. If you look at, is your organization making progress? Plus 17 believe that in the US we're making progress. 14 for white people, plus 12 for Black people. Look at the number for Latinx, plus 21, and look at the number for AAPI, plus 9. In terms of, so making gains, but the perception of how much progress we're making really varies depending on who you're talking to. If you talk to the next slide and we look at what are the issues that people are most concerned about, and the greatest concern is inclusive culture. I had a client a couple of weeks ago who pondered the situation that they had, and he said, I realized we spent all this time really focusing on diversity, and we are more diverse, but we are not inclusive. And that is the data point that the general population, you see it for white, Black, Latinx, and Asian, that an inclusive workplace culture is absolutely essential. But close behind an inclusive workplace culture is very much the lack of diversity of workforce in leadership. And this is something that we talked about when we started this process, and we said, you've got to get your own house in order. So for everyone who is saying something, the first thing people are going to do is, but what are you doing? And are you holding yourself accountable? Because in order for you to speak, you also have to have your own house in order. And those two things people are leaning into, is the culture inclusive here? And do you have leadership at the highest levels? If you proceed and look at, so how do we get better? We talked about this before in our first set of research. You have to be informed. You have to be educated in order for you to advocate. This slide highlights a significant obstacle. Nearly 1 in 4 lack a trusted source of information when it comes to DEI. And so how can you get better if you don't believe anything that anyone is saying? If you look at the numbers here, I do not trust anyone in the organization. 23 for white people, 22, 26 Latinx, 16, look at the number for Asian. Most trusted source within 30 here. My direct supervisor, 28. My racially diverse coworkers, 27. For those of us who are racially diverse coworkers, we probably can speak to this very intimately because we have become sources of information to our colleagues, and we apparently are trusted sources of information. So it is it's an opportunity and for some a burden. If you go to the next slide and you talk about what is super important here, what do you lose here? It's a damaged relationship. More than half say workplace racism has damaged their relationship with their employer. And all the research that we've talked about over the past year, this relationship of the employer, not business, not brands, but my employer has become so intimate, but that will be damaged if you believe that racism in my workplace has damaged my relationship with my employer, 55%, and that's up 14 points. If you look at the numbers in terms of age demographics, 18 to 34, up 19 points, 72. Look at for Democrats, and we talked about sort of the political divide here, 65%. But if I don't trust you, if I don't feel loyal, and if I don't feel that you're advocating, 55% of those polled said, I have a damaged relationship now with my employer. Now, if you look at the more racism in the workplace, the more damage to the employer relationship. So that, of course, makes sense. So what's the impact? The more racism I feel that I experience or that I see in my workplace, whether it's trust, loyalty, or advocacy, but the more I see that, the more damage to our personal relationship. You go to the next slide. This is material in this increasingly competitive war for talent. 4 in 10 would avoid employers that fail to take a stand against racism. And I think that when we go back into the field and ask this question, we will see this even more. 41% of the US general population says, I would not work for an organization that fails to speak out publicly at this time to address racism in this country. If you look at the numbers in terms of political affiliation, they're significant. And if you look at the number in terms of communities. But so we're losing talent. Your relationship is damaged. You're losing talent when you do not take a position. So who is left to change? Who do we have some semblance of confidence and trust in to actually change things? It's business. The business community must drive systemic change when we talk about systemic racism. And Richard, for me, one of the most interesting points was the division between where does this racism lie? Is it people or is it systems? But business is expected to address systemic racism in this country. When we say business, who are we talking about? CEOs. 8 in 10 on the next slide expect CEOs to act. 0 tolerance for racism. 79% of everyone we talked to said, I expect CEOs to do something. Now, note the word do here. It's not just say something. I expect CEOs to do something. And we've talked about this before, we've had CEOs say to us, I am a white male CEO. Do I have credibility? You do when A, your heart is in the right place, and B, when you surround yourself and you consult with the people who are most adversely affected by all of these issues. So if you look at the bottom here, the top five expected actions for US general population at the bottom, consult with Black, Hispanic, and Asian American community leaders on what the organization should be doing. So ask those questions. You are not expected to go it alone. If you go on to the next slide, broad support for CEOs to act beyond business. So yes, you have to say something about your business, but you also have to engage beyond. There was several months ago, we started to see these conversations about, do I say something about the legislation in Georgia? Guess not. Guess what? It's not just Georgia. This legislation is pending nationwide. And there was a debate, do I engage? Do I not engage? 55% of the US general population, CEOs, are acting appropriately when they boycott states because they believe the actions of the state government and government leaders and the laws that they pass are racially discriminatory. So the verdict is in on that. Yes, you are expected to take a stand and do something beyond your space. Reputation gains, what do you get? Reputation gains for companies that get their house in order. And things like replacing a racist logo, 56%, well, yeah, I expect that. Apologizing for racist actions, 38%, yes, for others, 20, but 58%, yes, I expect you to do that. I expect you to get engaged. The reputation gains for companies that advocate for racial justice. Again, we talked about what do you say, but what do you actually do? Reputation gains for companies that drive systemic change. Again, who particularly? Percent who say that they would view each action by a company as something I expect or exceeds expectations. You see the numbers here for health or beauty, to make it illegal to discriminate against people of color based on their hairstyle. I think you're aware of the fantastic work that's been done by Dove and others in terms of hair discrimination. A restaurant creating a program to increase the number of Black franchisee owners, encourage people to order from Asian restaurants. I think that was a nice time for Americans when we said, look, we've got to support by purchasing and buying from these restaurants. So what do you do with this? We have 4 recommendations. What are the small steps that you can take to ensure systemic change? One, be very clear, the stakes have intensified. Businesses that don't take action to address racism will lose customers, and they will lose employees, and they won't get employees that they even tried to get. 2, a C-suite imperative. And this was evidenced by the work that we did this summer. It has to be in the C-suite. CEOs must work to combat systemic racism and promote equity. And the majority of consumers support a CEO who does this. 3, progress on diversity falling short of equity and inclusion. Again, we talk about D, E, and I. I wonder if sometimes we're not even clear on what the D, E, and the I mean, but very clear here. While employers have made progress, hiring is not enough. Systemic change requires a sustained work and a change across the board. And 4, brands must move beyond campaigns. The campaigns are sometimes viewed as performative, as exploitive, as self-serving, so it's got to be beyond the campaign. I think with this, Jeff, I turn it over to you, and I hope that we have a robust conversation and discussion.
Hey, how's it going, lunch table audience? My name is Jeff Nelson, and I am the Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of Blavity, Inc. I want to thank our partners, Edelman, for talking us through that in-depth report. I have the pleasure of moderating a panel of experts, and I'm not going to lie, I'm a little just kind of in awe being amongst this panel because there's so much passion for this topic and so much experience. Before we went live. I was just listening to the sort of impromptu conversation that was happening. And it's just amazing. I wish we could have recorded some of that, but hopefully we'll be able to capture that in the discussion that we're having now. So I'm going to introduce the panel. And these are well-credentialed individuals. So I'm going to try to highlight some of the amazing stuff that they've done, but I won't be able to fit it all in because they have truly been groundbreaking pioneers in their work. So joining me today on the panel is Shelley Stewart. Shelley Stewart works at McKinsey. He is a leader within the private equity and principal investors practice. He serves a range of clients on marketing and sales topics. But in addition to his client work, Shelley leads McKinsey's research on Black economic mobility in the United States. He's published numerous articles and he's a speaker on the topic. Shelley is also on the board of directors of the National Black MBA Association, which I know near and dear from my days in college. We're also joined by Trish Smith, who is the Global Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Edelman, our partner in today's event. She's worked there for 17 years. She manages stakeholder outreach, strategic positioning, reputation management, and public affairs campaigns for so many Fortune 500 companies, nonprofits, associations, and others seeking to engage a broad spectrum of stakeholders. Her client list includes some amazing names like Chevron, Toyota, Starbucks, the Girl Scouts of USA, United Way of America, and Walmart, among many, many more. We're also joined by David Johns, who is the Executive Director of the National Black Justice Coalition. He is a former Executive Director of the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans. The initiative works across federal agencies and with partners and communities nationwide to produce a more effective continuum of education programs for African American students. We're also joined by Russell Jung, who is the co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate. Dr. Jung has authored several works, and I'll try to list some of the most interesting, including Family Sacrifices, the World Views and Ethics of Chinese Americans, Moving Movers, Student Activism and the Emergence of Asian American Studies, At Home in Exile, Finding Jesus Among My Ancestors and Refugee Neighbors, Sustaining Faith Traditions, Race, Ethnicity, and Religion Among the Latino, Asian American Second Generation, and Faithful Generations, Race and New Asian American Churches. And lastly, we are joined by Carla Sakim Hassan. Carla is the Citigroup Chief Marketing Officer. Carla is also a Lebanese war refugee. One of my favorite things about Carla is that on International Day of the Girl Child in 2019, Carla's team at Citi launched It's About Time, which was later selected by GWI as Campaign of the Month. Carla's Citi team worked in partnership with the Female Quotient to launch the Advancing Equality Calculator, a free tool to help organizations of all sizes calculate their raw wage gap and join the movement for pay parity. So as I said, we've got an amazing panel. I want to bring them up to the screen. And I'm just in awe to be on the stage with you all, and I hope everyone's doing well. I want to dive right into some questions because there is a lot to discuss, and really, I really just kind of want to start and discuss the overall landscape of this report that Edelman has released. And Russell, I'll start with you. What is something that you found most interesting or surprising in this data based on what you expected? So what was surprising? What did you expect to find? And did the report itself comport with those expectations?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Blavity, for inviting us. I'm too honored to be with this distinguished panel. The report was unsurprising to me that Americans didn't see racial progress last year. For me, on a personal level, it was clear racism has been on the rise. 82% of Asian Americans actually fear rising violence, not just racism. I'm not surprised that Americans expect corporations and brands to take stands on racism, both in broader society to become good corporate citizens and to get their own houses in order. So that's not surprising. For me, what was interesting was that employers are the most trusted institution of Americans. And I don't know why it just sort of struck me. I think it's just that one of the reasons could be is that we work more closely with our employers, especially if you work in a small business, and we're more intimate, whereas the other institutions like government or media may be farther removed from the typical American experience.
That's a very interesting insight. And David, I want to throw this to you. 46% of Americans believe that the business community has done little to address systemic racism in the country. And this is actually a 2-point increase from a little less than a year ago in August 2020. What do you think about that sentiment? Is that something that you agree with? And if so, what are some tangible actions that you think businesses need to take in order to improve upon that? And you know, just anecdotally, have you seen any changes from a year ago to where we are today?
Yes, Jeff, thank you for that. You asked 3 questions, so I'll try and offer at least 3 answers. The first is, I don't have to agree with the data. The data is where it is, and I worry that it is an underreporting. One thing I raised before we were live is concerns around the fact that most national and particular data collection tools and efforts do not account for the fact that so many of us live intersectional lives, right? Carla was talking about her identity and heritage. I know Trish and I spent a lot of time talking about multiple intersectional identities and challenges that Black women and girls face. I lead an organization that is intentional and unapologetic in acknowledging the intersection between racial equity and LGBTQIA+ equality. And so I'm wondering, like, how would these numbers increase if you ask people to account for their identities and experiences based on being members of a sexual minority community? I say that having spent just this week, today alone, editing 3 statements about the murders of Black trans women. And so what I acknowledge is that it is likely more Americans who believe that things have regressed with regard to progress toward meaningful, radical, and necessary inclusion. You asked a question about what companies can be doing in particular. There's a lot of evidence. Any student of history has seen that when companies, in particular CEOs, take public positions that are aligned with their values, that are associated with their tolerance for the kind of risk that's required for us to create inclusive, diverse, equitable workspaces, that they benefit. And so taking stands, boycotting, we've seen that recently in Georgia and North Carolina. Not Georgia more recently, but Georgia before that, we've seen evidence of success, right? I would also highlight that there are opportunities for companies to look internal to ensure that they have policies as well as practices that support equity-driven decisions, and opportunities for people to become leaders and to be supported in doing so. There are opportunities to assess and make commitments to things that are aligned with community values and things associated with social justice. And then the last thing I'll just speak to concretize that as an example is Sephora. Sephora is a global beauty brand. And 2 years ago, in response to some very public incidences of racial bias in their stores, they created a racial equity community group. And they started this process by delving into the research, by asking how their own practices contribute to bias and discrimination in their stores and in the industry. They made investments in community ambassadors who do work around and align with their values, but more so connected to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they've made significant investments to shift their own practices. They have a 15% pledge where they've increased the number of minority, Black, women-owned, people would say BIPOC, a term I don't like to use, leaders. They have an accelerator where they're increasing the number of folks connected to the brand, and an internship program that again is focused on diversity. And so I offer this as a way to the third point, to say that there's lots of examples of what companies can and should be doing, but whatever they do, it should be thoughtful, it should be aligned to their values and their mission, and it should be meaningful and measurable over time.
And David, you brought up something, and I want to bring Trish into this, you know, sort of what is the role of, you know, some of these tangible actions that corporations can take, but let's start at the top. What is the role of the CEO in setting that vision and being a leader in that regard? And Trish, I'd love to get your take on what CEOs can do to commit to, you know, not just after a tragedy, but long-term efforts to drive systemic change internally and externally.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you to the work that you and the team at Blavity do to tell our stories and to amplify our voices. I'm glad to be here today with the other panelists as well. It's a great question. We know from the research that CEOs are expected to act, right? 80% of the respondents said that CEOs must not only say something, but do something to address the issues surrounding systemic racism, as well as ongoing DEI efforts. Within that, they have an important role to play in modeling, right, this behavior that we're talking about, in changing perceptions in themselves, leaning in to learn more, right, and then demanding it of their teams, both their direct leaders in their C-suite as well as throughout their enterprise. They also have to make the commitment to ensuring that they're providing training and education opportunities for their employees throughout the enterprise. Are they getting the tools needed so that we can learn more about each other, cross-cultural competency training, unconscious bias training? I just conducted one earlier today. So how are we doing that to ensure that people are understanding what you're asking them to model? And thirdly, accountability. How are leaders then holding their people, their employees, accountable? If you're establishing a zero tolerance policy, an anti-racist organization, what are the tools you're providing? And then how are you holding everyone accountable throughout the enterprise? But it has to start with the leader issuing that vision, helping people understand what it means, giving them the tools to get there, and then holding them accountable along the journey.
And Shelley, I'd love to bring you in to get your take. So the CEO as both a leader in setting the tone internally and externally, a lot of that feeds into just brand trust, both internally and externally. And so as a marketer, right, and your role as a CMO and in general for people in that industry, what do you think that you can do to sort of help to make sure that initiatives in the marketing area align with the sentiments of the CEO? If the leader of the company has taken that stance and is trying to model those practices internally and externally, what does marketing have to do to support those initiatives?
Yeah, I think this was addressed a little bit earlier, and thank you very much for having me. But I think there's a few things that I think about when I think marketing in the context of being anti-racist. There's the one that everyone talks about, which is how do you make sure that your tactical marketing, whether it's digital or whatever the medium is inclusive, right? And is representative of the various kind of communities that we serve. And so there's a piece about just being very deliberate about what faces we're amplifying in the context of our marketing. I think from a more strategic perspective, so think about the role of the marketer as the facilitator of growth, really trying to understand the nexus between being anti-racist and developing products and services that benefit communities that sometimes are shut out. And so that's all about defining for the CEO and the rest of the organization, what is the commercial business case associated with getting this right? What are the product tweaks we need to make? Our pricing strategy, our go-to-market. How do we need to modify those things so that we're not just making advances in the four walls of our company, but we're also having an impact on broader society?
And Carla, would love to get your take specifically as it relates to cities. So we've heard from consumers that holding brands and companies accountable is important, and people are looking for updates on tangible steps that are being taken. So how has Citi addressed this?
Yeah, well, look, first of all, thank you so much for allowing me to be here. I think it's such an honor to be sitting with this group. You want to talk about imposter syndrome. So look, I think there's a couple of things. And we just talked about it. If you the research loud and clear says that that words are promising, certainly, but they mean nothing if they don't result in tangible action. And I think that's a big thing that we're seeing. And so, at Citi, what we like to say is it's time for companies to use their balance sheet for good, for the good of consumers, the good of clients and other constituents, because they're expecting it, quite frankly. And the data shows that they're expecting it. We've reached a tipping point with 42% of people saying that they're actually making choices based on what they see the actions of a company. And And, let me talk a little bit just in particular about some of the work that we've done around racial justice, because I'm really proud of it, because I think, we heard the calls just like everybody else did for racial justice. And it was clear to us that more of the same just wasn't going to do. And so, much like what Shelley was saying, we took a hard look at our own policies and practices to actively identify and eliminate bias and make sure that we are a company that understands and responds to the needs of all of the communities we serve and don't leave people behind. And so back in September of 2020, Citi and the foundation specifically, we announced more than $1 billion in strategic initiatives to help close the racial wealth gap and increase economic mobility in the United States. And I think that's really, really important, that the way that we approached it was a comprehensive approach that provided greater access to banking and credit in communities of color, increasing investment in Black-owned businesses, extending home ownership among Black Americans. So for us, it was really important that it wasn't just a marketing initiative. And it was really important that we weren't just writing checks. Of course, we wrote checks. We are doing that because we wrote the checks to the amazing organizations that are doing incredible work day in and day out on the ground. But we felt like it was even more important to use our business to address the biggest barriers that are impeding particularly the Black community from building generational wealth, from affording college to buying a home to starting a business to saving for retirement. And then where marketing came in was to tell the stories of the things that we had decided to do. So for us, telling just a marketing story or putting out an ad campaign that just said we are anti-racist or we stand against what's going on would have been part of the equation. And quite frankly, it was part of the equation. We did create a spot we called Lives that spoke to our brand values, but that wasn't enough. It felt like it had to be in concert with the action. And so from that perspective, I think marketing working very closely with the business, back to what was said before, making a case to the business that this is the right thing to do for business. Thankfully, I didn't have to do that at Citi, but working very, very closely with the business and the foundation and our communities to make sure that it was not just a marketing effort, but it's an overall business effort that gets amplified from a marketing perspective once we actually have the substance and we really think we're impacting the communities in the ways that we should with the platform we have.
Carla, that's such a prescient point because it's both, right? So these communities that feel like they are under attack, it is important, one, for brands and corporations to make those communities feel seen, heard, and cared about, right? That's absolutely important, but that is not enough. You have to have the other part of the equation, which is actually putting some muscle behind that, putting some dollars behind it, and having some tangible efforts that are going to steer resources, especially financial resources, to these communities and to businesses in those communities, entrepreneurs, and individuals in that community. And I want to bring Trish back in because I want to focus on the former piece, right? The marketing aspect of this, of making those communities feel seen, heard, and cared for, that's important. And, there are many brands like Dove and KFC have had their CMOs create campaigns to advocate for Black Americans in the last year. And Trish, I would love your perspective on how can this be done in a way where it feels authentic, right? So what do corporations and brands need to keep in mind when they're advocating for Asian Americans or African Americans or other communities so that it feels authentic and it doesn't just feel performative?
Sure, that's a great question, Jeff. And some of those answers have been given in the other responses, but I'm going to bring it back around. The point Carla just mentioned about financial commitment is a big one as well. When we mentioned what CEOs need to be doing, it is committing dollars to do the work, to drive the change, the systemic change we're looking to see. But marketers need to keep in mind a few things. Marketers' work in representing or authentically representing people of color must go beyond, I think as Shelley mentioned it, just diverse representation in an ad. And it has to live beyond a Heritage Month. We're in AAPI Heritage Month or Black History Month or Hispanic Heritage Month or another milestone or historical moment. And so what does that mean? It means that your marketing efforts cannot solely be based upon your products and your services. All right, people are saying, show me that you care about me. and the issues and causes that matter to me and my community. The systemic issues that we're dealing with in our community. Your efforts cannot be based upon a singular campaign or campaign moment. You have to commit to the long term. It's not a one-off ad or campaign that you launch in February and you put up and pack it up at the end of the month. This is not a one-time deal or any sort of silver bullet. It's about building a relationship and connections, and those are only built over and through time. It's also not only about what you see in terms of being authentic, right? It's what's behind the camera, what you don't see. It's about getting your own house in order. It's about making sure that you're changing not only the faces in your ads and campaigns that you create, but the diversity of the teams creating them, right? Who's developing the content you're creating? What does your leadership look like? Who are the vendors that you're partnering with? What does the media in which you pay to place those ads look like, right? Those are the things to really demonstrate your authenticity, to really be genuine in this work, to drive systemic change. It can not only be what we see, but how you have made sure the community is a part of the overall process and the life cycle of what you're creating and what you're bringing to market.
Trish, you're really preaching. I love to hear it. And it's relevant, I'll just take an aside and say that today, at Blavity, we've launched Blavity.org, and we've selected 12 fellows that we're taking through a 6-month program, giving them $10,000 non-dilutive grants to help them scale up their business. But part of what we're trying to do is leverage the fact that Blavity Inc. as a company, as a brand that has relationships with so many great companies. We're trying to talk to those corporations and say, hey, you've got to spend money with these Black businesses. You've got to actually, if you're marketing, send those dollars to Black publications and Black media if you want to reach these audiences. So it's just so good to hear you as an expert to promote that as well. Russell, I want to go back to you and talk about the Asian American community and how often that community goes unheard. We've seen recently in the news, unfortunately, so many acts of violence and discrimination against the AAPI community. And it's unfortunate that so many people, when they think of underrepresented or communities that are in distress or communities that are under attack, Asian Americans often are forgotten about. And we want to make sure that we are more mindful of that going forward. So Russell, I would love for you to just talk about what is important for the AAPI community to hear from business leaders, both inside and outside of their own organization.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I just sort of want to echo what everybody else has been saying, that Asian Americans now are really in a moment of crisis and distress with so much violence against us. And because we're neither white nor Black, and most race relations in the US is on a white-Black binary, Asians feel invisible and omitted. So having those CEO statements from the top actually are not just symbolic or performative. For Asian Americans, it's really meaningful because it does make us feel seen and heard. And they're meaningful because, last year, hate was so normalized by the language of the president, by hate speech, by the term Chinese virus. So sadly, what corporations and brands need to do is actually normalize love and respect with these official statements, with these sort of pronouncements from the top. But like Trish and Carla have said, you need to have a comprehensive approach. You have to put your money where your mouth is, and you got to follow up those official statements with real authentic actions that are institutionalized, that are long-term, that show commitment. So what we're looking for, Asian Americans, it's easy to, we think other people, when they say, I love you, it's not so easy, but Asian Americans, we show love by feeding each other. And so you got to have actions behind your words. And that's what we're expecting corporations to do, both in the broader community and especially in-house, right? We don't just want diversity inside the corporation. We don't want just recruitment. We also want promotion opportunities. We want to make sure groups are retained well. And so for corporations and brands to earn trust, at least within the Asian American community, put your money where your mouth is, develop, again, like we're saying, comprehensive approaches that are long-term, basically embody the values that you say that you hold.
Fantastic. I've got just a couple more questions and then we'll turn it over to see if there are any audience questions. So if you haven't already done so, go ahead and put those questions in the chat and we'll try to get those answers. Answered. But Shelley, I want to go back to you. And one of I saw this on Twitter, and I don't know who said it. I was just kind of scrolling, but the sentiment was basically that for Black people to get into the C-suite, it doesn't always have to be a DEI role, right? It doesn't always have to be in diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? You don't always have to be the chief DEI officer or the head of diversity to be a Black person in leadership at companies. And so, Shelley, I would love your perspective on, what do CEOs and leadership at companies need to do to make sure that their diverse population of employees are not always tasked with educating and teaching people how to not be racist in order to advance in the corporate world?
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I want to be clear. Being a chief diversity officer is an important role and an increasingly important role in the world that we're living in. And so I think that that's an important path, and I'm glad to see many companies elevate that to be a direct report to the CEO or to the CHRO, or whoever it may be. But I completely agree that we need to see diverse colleagues, in this case, Black colleagues, more rapidly advancing through the funnel across all sectors. I mean, the numbers are abysmal. You've seen some improvement at the board of director level. If you look at the Fortune 500, I think that one is actually a little bit easier to solve because you can kind of start with a big slate of people and select. It doesn't require that you actually build and nurture talent and de-bias processes, which is the issue with the hiring and promoting side of things. So I think CEOs need to we talked about de-biasing, but about being proactive in managing the pipeline, right? Really understanding, for each, for whether it's LGBTQ plus, whether it's Black women, at all the points of intersection, having a granular view of how people are moving through the funnel and understanding where the different breakpoints are and designing a set of interventions. And I think you have to have an aspiration. People don't like the word target. I'm not talking about quotas, but if you don't have a goal, then it's pretty hard to know whether you're progressing in the right direction. And so I think we also need to see folks lean forward and assert a vision. If you miss the goal, that's fine, but set an ambitious goal, be transparent about it so you can be held accountable, and that way things will start to actually move forward.
And David, want to bring you in here for the last question. We've talked so much today about how tangible action, especially when it comes to the dollars, both how corporations are spending their money in terms of their marketing, but also patronizing vendors that happen to be minority-owned companies as well. Those things are important. But I want to talk a bit about pay equity. And we look at pay equity in so many ways. Certainly, there's a well-known gender pay gap. So that's a place where we need to address pay equity, but also with respect to race, right? There are pay disparities with respect to African Americans being paid less than their white counterparts. So David, would love your take in your perspective just on this idea that as a African American in the workplace that is showing excellence, oftentimes you're tasked with doing more. Right? You have to work harder. You have to do so much more just to be seen as equal. And how does that tie into just the history of unpaid labor for people of color? And what are some things that leadership needs to do to really not just talk about, well, we want pay equity and pay parity, but to really actually go forth and make that a reality?
Yes, Jeff, thank you again with the three-part question. Let's just keep it simple. So I want to quote Kerry Washington in Scandal, the opening of season 2 of Scandal. She stood in a hangar with Papa Pope and he said to her, "What did I teach you growing up?" She said that I have to work twice as hard to get half as far. To all of Black America said amen, right? And in response to that, the solution is really simple. This is when I'll quote the Queen Rihanna, which is pay me what you owe me. And in particular, you can add a little Beyonce on that and acknowledge that when you pay me, you should pay me in equity, right? And so it is often the case that Black people, Black queer people, Black women, when I say women, I mean cis and trans, do a disproportionate amount of labor I mean that physically when we think about the fact that Black LGBTQIA+ folks are more inclined to be frontline service workers, those who are least likely to have the kinds of protections that we have seen prioritized for the provision of healthcare workers, for example, right? And so there are opportunities for us to really think critically about how it is that people are often put in positions where they are targets of hate or harm, and how simple it can be for companies and brands and individuals in positions of leadership to shift policy and practice so that that's not the case. With regard to pay equity, it's simple. Pay people more. Pay people with regard to equity. Be more transparent about the ways in which people are being paid. This is one of the ways in which I celebrate Sherelle Dorsey, who's doing a lot to leverage technology and to provide transparency so that we can have more clear conversations about who's being paid what and why. I also think that while we're talking about pay equity and gaps in particular, that we should name that there are opportunities for folks to also think about leave policies, parental leave, family leave, and sick leave in particular when we think about not only the implications of white supremacy and anti-Blackness, but the complications presented by the novel coronavirus. And so I say all of that, this is the third one, right, to say that anyone who cares about or purports to care about Black lives or anything associated with this moment that we're in terms of this global movement for radically inclusive social justice, or the things that in business context get often talked about as DE&I, can actually tie tangible, quantifiable metrics. This is the point that I heard Shelley make most recently, to ensure that there's progress, right? It makes me scratch my head when I think about the fact that there are companies like Google who have balloons floating in the atmosphere to help shift things dramatically, or the way that culture shows up such that you can't get people to say thank you or walk in line in New York for anything, but people do it when they walk into a Google building, and yet still the company is having challenges with regard to DE&I. I wholeheartedly believe that if the compensation of C-suite leaders were tied to DE&I goals and outcomes, we wouldn't have these conversations in the ways in which we're traditionally inclined to have them. So I hope that answers each of your questions.
David, I keep giving you the 3-part pop quizzes and you ace it every single time. So thank you for that. We're almost at time. There are tons of questions that I have and tons from the audience, and I don't think we're going to have time to get to them. But I just want to quickly end on just a lightning round. Just go through, everyone give a 1-sentence response. And one theme that I've seen come out of today's discussion, and Russell, you really hit on this explicitly, is that so much of what African Americans and Asian Americans and so many other communities feel has to do with leadership and what leaders are doing, whether those are the CEOs of companies or whether that's the president of the United States and what they're doing and saying. And work is a place that people want to trust. They want to see their employer and brands take the lead on some of these things. And there was a development in the news last week. Some companies are increasingly saying, well, we don't want employees to talk about politics at work because it's divisive. But as we've seen from this conversation, so much of our political environment and political rhetoric influences the reality of what we face, right? Those things are inextricably linked, unfortunately. So we'd love for people to just go around very quickly and just give a 1-sentence response to, what do you think about this idea where employers are saying, well, we don't want employees to talk about politics at work because it's divisive? Russell, we'll start with you.
Politics is divisive, but it's impacting us on a visceral, personal level. So we're bringing it to the workplace. You have to deal with it, or else you're going to lose employees. Again, the study shows that citizens and employees are expecting their corporations and their brands to do what's right.
Awesome. Shelley, lightning round, one sentence response to you.
Yeah, look, everything's been politicized at this point. So if we can't talk about race, then, we can't talk about anything. So we have to have the courage to recognize that there's a right side of history on a lot of these topics, and we want to be on it.
Awesome. Thanks, Shelley. Carla, I'll throw it to you for your quick reaction.
My quick reaction is, you know what, these things aren't necessarily about politics, even if they are being politicized. They are about humanity. They are about values. And I think that, those companies that lead with empathy, that understand their communities, that deliver for their communities, are going to be the ones that, to Shelley's point, are going to be on the right side of history.
Thank you. David, no three-part question this time. Quick reaction to you.
Yeah, I would love for leaders, especially those who are compensated as such, to appreciate that we have to find more comfort doing the uncomfortable work of leaning into this kind of required change. I also want to underscore and emphasize what the data shows, which is that it's costly for companies that choose not to do this work and learn to show up in public in ways that are aligned with things that they sometimes say when it's convenient or otherwise sexy. And I would just again highlight that there's a benefit, right? The president and CEO, Jean-Andre Rogetsch, just said to me an hour ago that diversity drives success in business. And in particular, diversity of leaders makes a positive impact on a company. We know hands down that when companies are diverse with a capital D, that everyone wins. There's a benefit in profit and in morale and in the way in which people feel like they can show up and show out. And if you are unwilling, aren't able to do this work, then I invite you to lead yourself into another occupation.
Thank you, David. And Trish, I'll let you have the last word on it.
Yeah, I echo everything that my good brother and dear friend David just shared. You didn't give a three-part question, but I'll give a quick three-part answer. One is that there's much more to gain than to lose. Secondly, this is not optional. It is a must. It's mandatory for business today. And thirdly, small steps will lead to longer strides and bigger results. And we will see systemic change if we all commit to that.
Trish, I can tell you've been doing this work and you've been great at it since the beginning, because that was a perfect encapsulation of everything. Panel, I want to thank you all so much for joining us. To the lunch table audience, I want to thank you all for tuning in. I had a great time being a part of this discussion, just soaking in all of this. I'm going to definitely go back and watch the replay so I can take some notes and just soak up all the learning. But thank you for tuning in. Please check out the report, share it with your network and your community, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.